Привет, друзья! G'day guys, Alex here from Soviet Lens Reviews. Today I wanted to have a little bit of a chat and share some tips of mine that I use whenever I go out to make sure that when I'm shooting with my Soviet or vintage lenses, I get really sharp photos. And lots of these tips, they're not just for Soviet lenses as well. If you've got any sort of vintage lens, then lots of these apply. So let's get into it and see what tips I use to make sure my photos stay nice and sharp. Okay guys, first up, my first tip is staying in the center of the frame. And this is a really important one with Soviet lenses. So whenever I'm shooting with Soviet lenses, I always try and put my subject in the center of the frame. Yes, there is of course a lot of other different framing options available, and putting something in the center of the frame is not always the most artistic way to go, but when you are trying to get the maximum sharpness, you want your subject to be in the center of the frame. Unlike modern lenses, which have often super sharp kind of resolving power from frame to frame, from the edges of the frame, Soviet lenses, they really didn't. And that was, of course, due to the fact that, they were made back in the 80s, the 70s, even the 60s and the 50s, when optical glass was not as advanced as it was today. Optical coatings were not as advanced as they are today. Manufacturing methods, all of that combined to make really a lot of these Soviet lenses and vintage lenses in general not super sharp from corner to corner. But what you will find is that Soviet lenses, they are almost always very sharp in the dead center of the frame. Take the Zenitar, the Vario Zenitar K that I'm shooting on today. So the Vario Zenitar K, it has a documented resolving power of 55 lines per millimeter in the center of the frame, but only 26 lines per millimeter towards the edges of the frame. And what that effectively means is that when you've got the Vario Zenitar K or many other Soviet lenses on your modern mirrorless full frame cameras, is that in the center of the frame, they're actually going to be out resolving your camera's sensor. So the Vario Zenitar K with 55 lines per millimeter in the center of the frame out resolves a 24 megapixel center. And the long and short of it is, that means that the lens isn't going to be limiting your sharpness when you put something in the center of the frame. And that is going to let you get some very sharp photos as long as your subject stays in the center. Okay guys, my second tip is to not stop down your aperture. Now this is a bit of a controversial one, but in my mind it's actually very, very important to consider, at least when you're trying to aim for a very perceptually sharp photo. Now, when you don't stop down your aperture, of course, that's going to mean that the out of focus areas in your image stay nice and blurry, they stay nice and kind of low contrast, and it is going to draw more attention to the area of your image that is in focus and that is going to be sharp. Whereas if you stop down your aperture, yes, you might get a tiny bit more kind of technical resolution on the area of the image that you're trying to focus on, but the viewer's eye is going to be drawn a little bit more to those out of focus areas that do have more contrast as you stop down. And of course, with Soviet lenses have very good longitudinal chromatic aberration corrections by and large. And what that's going to mean is that whenever you do shoot wide open, you're not going to have distracting loci, which is kind of color fringing in out of focus areas in the background of your image. So by and large, it is always worth it to try and shoot wide open with Soviet lenses and, just see if that gets you what you want in terms of sharpness. Next up, my third tip, avoid strong light sources in your frame. This is a killer for Soviet lenses and really one of the easiest ways to completely ruin the sharpness of an image. And even kind of weak or mid-tier light sources can often ruin the contrast of an image when you're shooting it with an uncoated or single-coated Soviet lens. So just avoid them completely. Don't point your camera towards the sun. Don't point it towards, in some cases, even a candle can flare on a lens like the Jupiter 11. So you really want to be avoiding any sort of strong light source with Soviet lenses. It wasn't until very, very late where they started to catch up the Soviets with their anti-reflective coatings and their multi-coatings. Overall, if you avoid strong light sources, you will not have to worry about that. Next up, this one is an easy one, and not just a tip for Soviet lenses, but a tip for most vintage lenses, most lenses in general, and that's to use a high shutter speed when you're shooting. And the reason for this is simple, of course, to avoid those little micro jitters, that motion blur that you can get when you're shooting with too low a shutter speed. And really, it shouldn't be too difficult to have an acceptable shutter speed now, because most modern cameras, including the Nikon Z6, which I'm shooting with today, have sensor-based image stabilization, which can allow you to shoot down to shutter speeds of, maybe 1/30th of a second, maybe even less, with a lot of lenses and still get a sharp image. Now, that's not to say that you should always shoot at 1/30th. I think this tip, you really should try and push your shutter speed as high as it can be if you're trying to get a sharp image. That is going to avoid, those little micro jitters, that motion blur that can show up when you're pixel peeping. And it is one of the most important things for a super sharp image. The Soviets, when they were designing lenses like the ERA line of lenses, which were used for kind of super high resolution microfilm reproductions with 600 lines per millimeter of resolution, it was often more important to them that the mount of the lens and the camera was super sturdy. So that is one to keep in mind. Next up, and my last fifth tip here, it is to use a low ISO. ISO 100, ISO 64, whatever your camera's base native ISO is. This is an easy one. Of course, you do remove the possibility of having too much noise in the frame when you use your camera's base ISO. And as well as that, you get a higher dynamic range. And a high dynamic range can often increase the sort of perceptual sharpness of the image, because when you've got more colors to play with, then you are going to have more contrast to sort of play with as well, in theory. And this is important because whenever you're shooting with a Soviet lens, yes, of course, you want to shoot at low ISO to reduce noise and increase sharpness in that way. But Soviet lenses, although they didn't have, the technical sharpness on paper as modern lenses, they actually have just as good of kind of color transmittance characteristics as many modern lenses do. And an easy way to think about this is that a modern lens, let's call it a 4K lens, 4K HDR. Well, a Soviet lens, it might not be 4K, but you could still categorize them as HDR because they do transmit color, by and large, very well. So shoot at low ISO and you are going to be rewarded with sharper images. So guys, that is it for today. I hope these tips help you to take some sharper photos with your Soviet or vintage lenses. Did I miss anything? Let me know down below. Drop us a comment. Remember to like the video as well. Subscribe for more. But until the next time, thanks for watching and I'll see you there.